All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce today's seminar speaker, Dr. Alex Konings. Dr. Konings is an assistant professor of Earth System Science at Stanford University. She earned her PhD at MIT in Civil and Environmental Engineering and completed a postdoctoral fellowship through Stanford University as a visiting postdoc at JPL and at Columbia University. She's earned numerous awards, including the NASA New Investigator Award, the NSF Career Award, and most recently, the AGU Global Environmental Change Early Career Award. On behalf of the department, I'd like to thank you, Alex, for joining us today to share your work with us.
All right. Well, thanks, Nicole. And I'll start off by thank you for the invitation. It's really exciting to have had a day full of Zoom meetings with folks at UCI. So I've greatly enjoyed it so far. But yeah, I'll just kind of jump right in here. So you've all probably read the title by now. So I'll be talking about plant water sensitivity and wildfire vulnerability in the Western US today. This is work that really was all led and fully deserving of the credit for by Krishna Rao, who's a PhD student in my group. So his picture is here on the screen if you ever run into him at AGU or something like that. And then we also collaborated with Park Williams, with Noah Diffenbaugh, and Marta Yebra. So the nice thing about, even if it's a virtual talk and if I'm not in person about giving a talk at UCI, is I don't think I really have to motivate much here. That burned area in the Western US has been increasing, and that's a concern. So you see that in these figures here in terms of trends in burned area and wildfire in recent decades. And one of the key reasons for that is climate change, as you see in this figure here. So on the x-axis here is just an average of several measures of how dry the atmosphere is in different years. And when we look across the Western US and we compare the burned area and forest, you just see there's a pretty tight correlation here between those two factors. Now I should be careful, right? Climate change is not the only reason for increases in burned area. There's other factors like ignitions, like fuels management, but certainly climate change is significant, as you can see in this figure. And as you, honestly, when you go to literature, also can see in a ton of other papers that have made plots like this. Maybe what they'll do is they'll have a slightly different metric of what the relevant climate or atmospheric aridity variable is. But over and over again, we see this sort of relationship between climate and burned area in there annually. But interestingly enough, when you go to sort of more localized analyses and stop this Western US-wide view and look at regional scales, the sort of picture is a lot murkier, right? What's being shown here is for different ecoregions. We have a correlation once again between some measure of climate or aridity and burned area. But you see that a lot of these ecoregions have whitish colors that have a correlation very close to zero. And there's a couple different reasons that could be happening, right? Maybe these analyses and the exact climate metric and playing kind of fast and loose with that. Maybe that's not being captured exactly right, and the sort of local influence of meteorology and patterns changes. Or maybe this has something to do with vegetation type modulating the relationship. And what I'll sort of argue today is that maybe one of these factors is the effect of different levels of flammability of the fuel. So hopefully, even if you're not, I know many of you at UCI are interested in wildfire, but I hope even if you're not interested in wildfire, this idea of flammability in fire is sort of intuitive, right? Drier fuels are going to catch fire more easily, burn more intensely. And the sort of wildfire community really tends to express this in terms of this metric of the fuel moisture content. And I've just put up the definition here. So this is just going to be the ratio of how much weight of water you have in the piece of fuel that you're looking at over the weight of everything that is not the water times 100. So this is sort of normalization of how much water content you have. Now, there's sort of multiple different types of fuels out there, right? We have dead fuels, things like the twigs in this picture, or maybe even dead stems or bigger branches. And with dead fuels, it turns out that the moisture content, that fuel moisture content specifically, basically is sort of constantly equilibrating to the surrounding air. So if you have good data on what the local atmosphere has been doing in terms of humidity and other factors, you can sort of calculate that dead fuel moisture content from the atmospheric conditions pretty directly. But it's a little bit more complicated for live fuels, or actual vegetation that's alive and its components that might burn. And that's because we sort of can look back at plant physiology and know that that's related to water stress. And so you see that in this figure on the left. And so what's on the x-axis here is the relative water content. So basically just a different normalization of that water weight. And I've in this particular paper, this was a review paper, so we just took some curves from the literature, from what plant physiologists called so-called pressure volume curves that relate the water content to water potential in plants, the sort of driving force that actually drives the movement of water through the plant and eventually stomatal closure and transpiration. And so you see that there's, maybe variable from the species, but a close one-to-one relationship here. And so in fact, when you go and you then look at a different normalization of water weight, you look at live fuel moisture content. In fact, you also see that this live fuel moisture content depends on water potential. So it's going to depend on potentially on the water stress and the plant hydraulics of water moving through the plant. Now, this relationship here potentially reflects a ton of different factors that have to do with the specific vegetation that you're interested in, right? So there's if we're interested in how fuel moisture content evolves because it's related to water potential, that could be affected by, for example, the rooting depth and how easily there's sort of water uptake under different conditions. There's stomatal traits that affect water potential and live fuel moisture content. There's xylem traits, structural traits that end up having an influence as well, not to mention soils and topography and all these factors, right? And I'm not even going to go through, I think I've probably named a number of things in this figure here. But the point is there's a lot of sort of different ways that vegetation has adapted to drought that all might potentially influence live fuel moisture content. But there hasn't really been a lot of work within the wildfire community on linking sort of these water stress responses of vegetation and wildfire vulnerability as it's affected by live fuel moisture content variations. And so that's partially what this talk is about. And I'll argue that really hasn't been looked at before, in part because live fuel moisture content is super laborious to measure. You basically have to go out and take destructive measurements. So you're collecting samples, then you tend to dry them for 24 hours to get all the water out. So it's a long taking, very laborious process to get measurements on the ground. And the U.S. Forest Service basically has the most impressive network of this anywhere in the world. But even so, we're talking, a couple hundred sites across the Western U.S., these dots that you see in the slide here. So today I'll sort of be talking about flammability and wildfire and vegetation traits. And I'll argue that the way that we can get some physical insight in all of these issues that I've just brought up is to use microwave remote sensing, which I'll talk about more in a second, is kind of directly sensitive to live fuel moisture content. And I'll be using that to sort of answer the question that's on the screen here, right? I gave an explanation that was fairly hand-wavy for why soil and plant hydraulic traits that affect water uptake might affect live fuel moisture content and might affect flammability and wildfire. But the question is sort of, is that a significant effect, right? Does this influence of vegetation water stress response actually affect wildfire vulnerability and wildfire patterns? Now, as I mentioned earlier, there's a ton of different vegetation traits that influence how different species and different plants respond to water stress. I'm not going to go through all of that here. It's just too much to disentangle at scale to get a clear answer. But I'll sort of be defining one metric, the plant water sensitivity. So you'll hear me talk about plant water sensitivity several times. So with that, let me kind of take a step back here from this long introduction and talk a little bit more about what we'll do in the rest of the talk. So I mentioned microwave remote sensing is really useful for this particular question. I'll explain in the next couple slides a bit how and why that is, how we do that remote sensing. Then I'll try and address the main question. How does the plant water sensitivity affect fire vulnerability, if at all? I'll talk a little bit about how that might interact with sort of where people live, population distributions. And then I just kind of wanted to take a step back because I'm a pretty big microwave remote sensing geek and sort of talk about what else we might be able to do with microwave remote sensing of vegetation water content and how that relates to all this wildfire stuff. So with that, let's talk a little bit more about the remote sensing. So as I said, what's nice about microwave remote sensing is that it's directly sensitive to the water in vegetation, that relative water content that I mentioned earlier. Now, there's a lot of sort of radiative transfer that we could go into that I won't go into for the sake of time, but I should mention that it's not just sensitive to water content, at least on the vegetation side. It's also sensitive to the type of vegetation have, the structure a little bit, and the amount of biomass. So how can we use microwave remote sensing to get at LFMC, given that you also have this sensitivity to biomass? Well, actually, if we go back to our definition from before, the live fuel moisture content is sensitive to the ratio of the plant water over the dry biomass. So both of those factors are at play here. What we can do is we can take advantage of the fact that there's also a sort of biomass vegetation non-water sensitivity in multispectral data to try and disentangle these two factors. So that's exactly what we did. We took advantage of field measurements that I mentioned before in that network, and then basically we just used machine learning to combine microwave data from Sentinel-1 and reflective data from Landsat to map live fuel moisture content. And when we did that, we got some air performances that are, you can look at on the left here. RMSE of about 25%. Depending on your background, that may or may not seem like a lot. It's basically on par with sort of the state of the art of what you can do with other types of remote sensing. But one of the advantages of our method is we can apply it across the entire Western US. And so when we tested it also, we did that at a much larger number of sites than most of the sort of typical multispectral and hyperspectral remote sensing methods that are really have algorithms that are very narrowly applicable to only a couple different species and vegetation types. So when we do that, right, we have these statistics that cause us to believe in our ability to estimate live fuel moisture content with remote sensing. And then you get maps that look something like this here, right? So you have, because we're using SAR, have really high spatial resolution, which is particularly relevant for something as diverse as fire. And you can already hopefully get a sense from these maps here that depending on where you are in time, the spatial patterns of the live fuel moisture content are going to be changing in quite interesting ways. So we use these data then to go back and say, okay, well, let's go beyond just looking at LFMC, and let's look at these soil and vegetation hydraulic traits that I mentioned before. Can we estimate, this plant water sensitivity as sort of an integrated metric that answered this question on the slide here? How does how much does LFMC change in response to climate? So if you have, some sort of climate anomaly, I'll go into what I mean by that in a second, but if you have some sort of climate anomaly, right, do you have vegetation that manages to stay relatively buffered, maybe even as things get wetter and drier, and sort of close its stomata easily and keep flow going through xylem and water taken up by deep roots? And do you have something like on the left here, where the LFMC stays pretty constant? Or might you have a different type of vegetation in a certain location, where as climate gets more or less wet and dry, you have much larger variations in LFMC just because the soil and rooting and xylem and stomatal traits don't provide that kind of buffering that might happen in other vegetation types. So that's really what we want to try and get at here with the plant water sensitivity. And just to calculate that mathematically, what we did is we said, okay, well, what is a good climate anomaly that we can feel confident in here? We use the dead fuel moisture content, just because, as I was mentioning in the very beginning, that's something that we know kind of equilibrates to climate in a wildfire relevant way, right? And then we use an autoregressive equation between live fuel moisture content and dead fuel moisture content to account for the fact that plants and soil add hydrologic memory. And we looked at the plant water sensitivity as really dependent on the slopes of that autoregressive equation. So when we do all of that, you get a map that looks something like this. So this is at 4 kilometer, because that's our climate data resolution, what we call the plant water sensitivity across the Western United States. There's some large scale patterns here, but you see that this is also quite heterogeneous from pixel to pixel, right? And that actually makes some sense to me, because there's a whole lot of different sources of variability that you're integrating here, not just variability between species, but we also know that for hydraulic traits, intraspecific variability is particularly large. There's effects of sort of competition and diversity, both on the traits and how that integrates to the 4 kilometer scales. There's huge effects that you would expect based on soils, topography, disturbance history, and how that affects the stand properties. So this heterogeneity here, I mean, it's kind of like a feature, not a bug, right? And so now what we have is finally a map of a sense of what we think of as vegetation's response to water stress, and we can then go and test whether or not this has an effect on wildfire. So that's what I'll do next after a quick sip of water here. All right, and so when we looked at that in this work, what I mean by wildfire vulnerability here is really that pattern that I showed almost in the second slide, which is how does burned area change as the atmosphere gets drier or as the vapor pressure deficit increases, as sort of has been happening and we expect to continue to happen with increasing temperatures with climate change. So just because there's kind of a lot of different ground I'm covering in this talk, maybe I'll take a step back here and sort of go back to a conceptual figure of our question and our hypothesis, right? If we say, okay, we're interested in burned area responses to VPD. So let's look at conditions conceptually, just think about conditions of high VPD, we expect that to potentially cause water stress in the plant that causes the fuel moisture content to decrease, right? This LFMC drops here. But then depending on the ecosystem, maybe that drops a little bit or a lot. So if you have a relatively drought-sensitive ecosystem with high plant water sensitivity, right, LFMC drops a lot. Your little schematic trees here look pretty yellow or brown, depending on your preference on color names. Or if you have a much more insensitive ecosystems, and that same high vapor pressure deficit might cause a much lower drop in live fuel moisture content. And then the question is sort of, does that translate to the amount of area that's burned either in a drought sensitive or drought insensitive ecosystem? And so, by doing this, we focus on that VPD effect. We kind of get around the fact that burned area and wildfires depend on a ton of things beyond flammability alone, right? Ignitions, fuels, etc. So what does that look like? It looks, just to translate it again schematically in plots, it looks something like this, where we consider kind of the slope of burned area with vapor pressure deficit for different types of plant water sensitivity. So what we did in this project is we went back to our map from a couple slides ago of plant water sensitivity across the Western US. And we started out just saying, hey, let's take all of the pixels that have similar PWS plant water sensitivity across the entire region. And as you can kind of see on the slide here, you might say for some specific bin of PWS, those pixels might be from all over the place, because remember, our map was very heterogeneous. But we're going to pull all of those sort of spatially disparate locations and put them in one bin. And then for each bin, we can go and say, okay, well, what does that slope of burned area with vapor pressure deficit now look like? Is it, pretty steep, or is it pretty shallow? And so that's just kind of illustrated for two different bins here. Right, and if you squint at these two illustrative plots here already, you can kind of start to see the answer. But when we put all of that together, you get this reasonably strong relationship here, right? Where the burned area sensitivity to vapor pressure deficit varies quite significantly with plant water sensitivity, right? I mean, these numbers, you have basically a factor of two, a little bit more than two difference between really sensitive and really insensitive ecosystems. And I've set up this talk that in a way that may not actually be a surprise to you, right? I mean, I've sort of said, hey, we think there should be a relationship between the plant traits and the LFMC and the wildfire vulnerability. But I still think that this result is quite significant because A, we weren't sure that there would be a relationship here, that it would be significant enough. But also, this is not really something that our wildfire models really account for at all. Operationally, if you actually have sort of a quantitative accounting for LFMC effects, it's usually done just based on maybe plant functional type at best, and mostly on atmospheric conditions, without any sort of accounting for the fact that the vegetation properties that are relevant here are quite heterogeneous. So we think that this is illustrative of the power of vegetation water stress responses. I also wanted to talk a little bit about how this effect of plant water sensitivity now might interact with the population distribution, human population distribution in the Western US. And that's relevant because if you care about wildfire, one of the things that comes up quite a bit is that the effects are quite different depending on exposure, right? If you have a wildfire burning down properties or even entire towns, that's completely different than if it burns down some remote area with no kind of human structures or presence nearby. Of course, you also lose a lot of ecosystem services, in the sort of picture on the left. But certainly, human exposure is a big factor in how much wildfire in that burned area that we studied before matters. And so in wildfire terms, what that looks like is people kind of throw around this phrase, the WUI, the wildland-urban interface. So that's just defined as kind of the zone of transition between wildlands and more developed areas. So, any area where housing is less than 25% of the total area. And those are sort of some of the areas of highest risks from a human exposure point of view. And we know that population growth in the WUI in the Western US has been quite significant over the last couple of decades, right? So as an example for this paper here, for example, we saw an approximate doubling of the population in the WUI between 1990 and 2010. And so we can ask ourselves, now that we've seen that plant water sensitivity has a big influence on sort of burned area vulnerability, what is happening with this doubling of population? Is this happening in places with high or low PWS, and therefore does that have an effect on kind of the wildfire risk? I mean, you would hope that these are pretty separate, independent things driven by completely different reasons, so that maybe there's not much of an interaction here. But I think it's still worth asking the question. And so we did, and we went back for sort of tractability to our curve from a couple slides ago showing the relationship between wildfire risk from a VPD point of view and plant water sensitivity. And we just said, okay, we're going to divide the plant water sensitivity into kind of 3 categories based on this curve. We have sort of a low hazard region where risk is reasonably low, then medium hazard starts to increase, and then you really get a fairly nonlinear effect here in the high hazard in the last couple bins category. And then we can see, okay, well, in these, how much population change in the WUI has there been in WUI areas in these 3 different sort of PWS classes. And when we do that, you see that actually it turns out that there's been a lot faster growth in the sort of high hazard regions, the high plant water sensitivity, high burned area risk regions than there have been, on average or in low and medium hazard areas. So, on average about 60% higher or so in these high hazard areas. And that relative change is significant when we actually translate that to the number of additional people in this high hazard region relative to the rest. That's an additional 1.5 million people. So that's approximately the population of Seattle and San Francisco combined. So this is significant. And again, we're not really accounting for these differences in plant water sensitivity in any of our, planning or risk assessments. All right, take another sip of water here. So what I wanted to just kind of do in the last sort of section of this talk is move away a little bit from fire applications, excited as I am about the work that I just presented, but also talk a little bit more about microwave remote sensing in general and what it can be used for when we're interested in plant water stress beyond this map of plant water sensitivity that I showed today. Just because this is something that my group is really interested in. And so, just to do a little bit of housekeeping as a starting point, right? There's kind of 2 types of microwave remote sensing. We have active sensing from radars, and most relevantly, synthetic aperture radars that are really high resolution, right? That can get you that 250-meter resolution that I showed in the LFMC maps today. But there's, a lot of complex scattering issues at play that come up with SAR. And so when you can't use the kind of machine learning trick that we did, it's pretty hard to extend our understanding of LFMC from SAR beyond the Western US where we have training data. But separately, you could also use a radiometer at microwave frequencies, passive measurement, where you look at the gray body emission from the land surface. And that's often used to derive this quantity known as the vegetation optical depth, or VOD. Excuse me. And the VOD, much like LFMC, has some of the same information content and dependence on water. And in fact, beyond that, not only do you have this sort of dependence, we know from both theory and from a variety of field studies that it's a relatively linear sensitivity, as you see in this equation here. So with radiometers, we also have a water content sensitivity. It's much coarser resolution data, about 100 times coarser, depending on how you count, but we can get global data sets of plant water content through VOD. And because you have that sensitivity to water content for VOD, also from radiometers, there's a sensitivity to leaf water potential, again, our sort of driving force that controls stomatal closure. So you see that on the left here, for example. This is data from a field experiment we did in Harvard Forest, where we use a tower VOD that has a pretty small footprint so that we can really get in there and compare it to in situ data pretty cleanly. And you see, just from the diurnal cycle alone, that we have a pretty strong match between leaf water potential and VOD. And so, honestly, in my super biased opinion, I think there's a ton of sort of studies of plant water stress beyond wildfire that you could do with this data. And I've just shown a couple of them on this slide. So we looked a couple years ago now at productivity in grasslands and how those respond to climate changes. And we see that once again, this sort of plant water stress and the integration of stomata and xylem and isohydricity that we can map with remote sensing, that if we look at VOD, we can get traits, and that tells us something about grassland productivity and how it responds to climate. We've also done work with VOD as a measure of water stress in this collaboration with Bill Anderegg that's listed in the middle of the slide here, where we looked at reductions in ET during drought and compared them for ecosystems that are sort of diverse in terms of the hydraulic traits of the plants that are there, the species that are there, and ecosystems that are less diverse. And we see a strong relationship, sort of effects of hydraulic competition and niche finding, if you will. And then we've used VOD also for drought-driven tree mortality estimation as well. So I think there's a ton of different things. I'm being pretty brief here, but it's a ton of different things I think you can do with this data. And one of the things that we've done is we've tried to go beyond plant water sensitivity or integrated traits, like I mentioned earlier today, but go towards mapping traits that you might actually be able to put in sort of a hydraulically enabled land surface model. And so you see some of our example maps here. You got the P50 is sort of the xylem water potential at 50% loss of conductivity. The isohydricity I mentioned earlier is kind of integrated stomata and xylem trait. And then we also have, a measure of marginal water use efficiency that goes into a lot of stomatal models. So we have, now arguably for the first time, or at least globally, basically for the first time, maps of how vegetation in different places responds to water stress differently. And so now kind of the next step for us is to try to put this into models. But I hope that even though we haven't finished that step, that you can still believe me and get a sense that this data is potentially really useful for helping understand the spatial diversity and all kinds of aspects of how vegetation responds to water stress. And certainly these maps, are built with radiometer data, but the LFMC data set that we're able to use for wildfire is just another related piece of information that we can use in that. And so with that, I'll just kind of put up the conclusions here, right? So you saw that the changes in plant water sensitivity can increase the burned area sensitivity to VPD by as much as a factor of 2 across the Western US, and that the highest plant water sensitivity risk areas, that's where the wildland-urban interface population is growing the fastest. And then last but not least, I just kind of wanted to make this point that LFMC and other microwave remote sensing data sets could be useful for studying a variety of questions related to vegetation and water stress. And yeah, with that, I'd love to see if you have questions.
All right, thank you very much. We have a pretty full house here, so I'm going to recommend that for questions, we use the raise hand tool, which is under reactions at the bottom of the Zoom screen, or you could put questions in the chat, and then I can just kind of go through as I see them coming in for you to ask Alice questions that you have. Okay. All right, Jim, I see your hand. Go ahead.
Hi, Alex. That was a really nice talk. Really enjoyed it. Great work. I guess my question is just to follow up more on the link with the fires and the plant water sensitivity. I'm curious if you've looked to see what's the relationship between plant functional type or what's really driving this higher plant water sensitivity? Is it the chaparral and also is it or is it are the forests having a lower sensitivity? And then because I guess you had a map, but they almost look like they are overlapping the high and the low sensitivity places. I couldn't really tell exactly where those spots were, and so that's my first question. Then related to that is what is the interannual variability look like in that? I mean, can you get that from a passive microwave product? And what we had these horrible fires in 2020 and 2021, and did they look like? Do they especially in the places where there's the so I'm trying to understand this map, where the high places are and the low places.
No, that's a great question. Because you're right, it doesn't look like the instinct might be, oh, should the first order follow just land cover and chaparral versus forest, like you mentioned, and it doesn't, right? So what we've tried to do, and we're just not quite there yet, is we've tried to sort of just compare this to a whole bunch of different things that could possibly explain the variability in this map, just with a random forest model. And when we do that, I'm trying to remember the number because it's been a while now since we returned to this, but I think it's about maybe, I think it's 75% or so of the variability is what we're at now, just trying to understand this that we can explain. And about 57% of that can be explained without having to sort of even invoke land cover, but just by looking at sort of independent information about soil type and about sort of what we have in terms of maps of hydraulic traits otherwise, and canopy height, and sort of things that are not plant functional type, but that tell us something about vegetation and plants. So like, Anna Trugman had a map of P50 that she got from species-specific upscaling in forest that she published in PNAS a couple of years ago, for example. Like that turns out to be a big factor. So in that analysis, the plant functional type shows up pretty low. I was a little bit, I didn't go into maybe as much detail as I could have in this talk, but the soil traits show up a lot as well. Soil hydraulic traits, so estimates of porosity and maximum soil conductance.
Okay, so it's less connected to plant traits then, you think?
Well, I think it's about it's like I think it's kind of both, right? So I think the plant traits are probably responding to the soil traits to some degree.
Okay.
And then the soil traits are coming up because the plant allows you to take up, the water from the soil in a different way, depending on whether that water like flows away quickly or not. Mm-hmm. So it's like kind of like soil and plants, and the plant response to that is how I think of it.
Okay.
But that's just our I'm just kind of throwing our preliminary data at you because we haven't fully finished analyzing
It's awesome.
that.
And have you looked like for 2020 or 2021, I mean, is there a vegetation optical depth signal that maps onto these giant droughts that triggered these massive wildfires, just like at a regional scale?
Yeah, so we haven't looked at chaparral specifically. Certainly you see that like the first order, just if you like integrate across the region, right? Either for our maps of LFMC, which are from SAR, or for passive vegetation optical depth, like you see the signal to some degree, especially in our SAR data, but also a bit in the vegetation optical depth. We haven't broken it out again by chaparral versus others, and it's kind of hard to say. Okay, yeah, it'd be interesting. But yeah, like we see. So I will say very quickly, and I know I'm giving you a long response here, but we also are now starting to show in some of our preliminary results a relationship between some of the ignitions in recent years and the likelihood of fire happening in an area based on these maps.
That's neat. Yeah.
So there's a relationship there.
That's cool. Cool. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Great talk. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you. And then Anne has a question up next.
I just wondered if you looked at lightning in respect to this, the frequency of lightning.
We have not. We're still trying to get our hands on good lightning data sets. If you have advice for us, I'd love to hear it. But yeah, that's a challenge we've had. But it certainly is, it would be, especially with that sort of ignitions work that I mentioned, it would be super, super relevant and a nice way to, getting good data on where ignitions might be. I was discussing this with Shane at lunch today. That's quite difficult, and lightning is a way around that.
Lawrence, you're up next.
Hey, I was just wondering about the striping effects that you can see in the map here. It's like you can see it, I guess, going through Nevada, like bisecting Nevada vertically, or through Texas. And I guess if you could do like spectral correction using like large scale east-west gradients or something, and have you played with how that impacts your results?
Yeah, we haven't really had time to look into it. This is just when there's the SAR swath is missing a lot over these regions. We haven't really, we've sort of said, hey, there's enough keeping us busy just looking at this data set in general that we haven't worried too much about filling it in yet. I will say this is, I think a long enough record of LFMC, it's about 5 years now, to give us some confidence in this map and what it looks like. But it's not a super long record yet, just limited by the fact that we use Sentinel-1 as an input. And so I think over time, those striping effects, at least for the PWS map, should go away on their own.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, does anyone else have a question for Alex? Okay.
I'll say I'm sorry. No, I just realized I was slightly incomplete answer to Lauren. So we do a little bit of correction, just to be clear, for different incidence angles. I suppose I should be complete. But anyway, go ahead, Nicole.
All right, thank you. Well, thank you very much for coming to do this seminar with us, and we really appreciate your time.
Thanks again for the invitation. This has been it's been great. It's always a little hard to engage with the audience doing Zoom talks, but I've really enjoyed my day of meetings and the questions. So thanks a lot.